It's good. If you will, go ahead and open your psalm book to number 340, 340. Brother Leonard's going to lead us in that song. Then Alan, if you will, word of prayer. You will go ahead now and open your Bibles to the book of Proverbs, to chapter 22 and verse 11. Chapter 22, verse 11. And I mentioned to Brother Willie before the announcements this morning, I said, now, please go ahead and tell everybody that's trying to be perked up and be awake. I know you lost an hour of sleep, but he said, that's your job, not mine. So what we're going to try to do this morning is to make sure that we focus our minds on the God's Word. There's so much that's to be learned from studying the book of Proverbs. And so if I can get this to cooperate with me, if I can't, then we'll do something else. There we go. Verse 11. He who loves purity of heart and has grace on his lips, the king will be his friend. Now, for just a moment, I think you have to go back and try to put yourself into whom Solomon is writing these things. To whom is he basically speaking to start with? His son. And what kind of messages is he providing for him? Message of wisdom. What's right versus what is wrong. What makes life better. And he's talking about here, he who loves purity of heart, what will be on his lips? If a man loves being pure of heart. Okay, it says grace has grace on his lips, but I'm thinking primarily before you get to the grace, if I'm thinking of telling the truth all the time, what's going to be on my lips? The truth. I'm not going to shade it. I'm not going to try to make it impure, because if you have purity of heart, you love purity of heart. If a man loves someone who tells you the truth, you're going to tell the truth yourself, are you not? Then it says, and, which is a conjunction, has grace on his lips. Do you remember what Paul told the Colossians? He says, let every man's, talking about grace and, how we speak to one another. So we need to be the kind of people here who have that kind of grace. And then he says, the king will be his friend. If you were a king, what kind of people would you like to be your subjects? Honest people? People who tell the truth? People who speak with grace, favor? Someone who's not harsh and unkind? Courage to do so? If you go to chapter 16 and look at verse 13, it says, righteous lips are the delight of kings, and they love him who speaks what is right. Now, I know that many people today say, well, most of the rulers surround themselves with yes men. But a real ruler surrounds himself with people who will tell him the truth. Even though it may not be the direction he thinks he wants to go or needs to go, they'll tell him the truth. And I would add to the pure in heart, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 8. You remember what Jesus said? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And one other passage is going back to Proverbs again, chapter 14 and verse 35, where he says, the king's favor is toward a wise servant, but his wrath is against him who causes shame. So, speaking from the perspective of trying to teach your son, if you have someone who tells you the truth, he's your friend. He's your real friend. And I would suggest the same would be true for all of us. Who's your real friend? The person who will tell you what you want to hear, or the person who will tell you what you need to hear? What you need to hear. If I get ready to come to services and I go up and say, Alan, does everything look all right on me? And he says, yeah, it looks fine, but my tie's pulled around sideways and my hair's all messed up. Well, he's not helped me if he's not told me the truth. Okay, let's go to verse 12. This is an interesting verse here. The eyes of the Lord preserve knowledge, but he overthrows the words of the faithless. Now, I would suggest to you that there's a connection here with this term, the words. The Lord preserves knowledge. What do you mean he preserves knowledge? He knows what's right versus what's wrong. And he makes sure that it is out there, if you will, for someone to hear. But he overthrows the words of those faithless people. It will be seen that what their advice they're giving you will turn and go the wrong direction. And I think about Rehoboam, the advice that he asked for. How should I rule this people? He got advice from two different categories of people. One from the older, one from the younger. The older people said what? Be a servant. Help these people. The other one said, hey, you let them know who's boss. And the bad advice that Rehoboam got, did it reflect badly on him? Sure did. And so you listen to the words of the righteous. And when I think about people here who are faithless, I think about people like Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 3, where he talks about people whose faces are harder than flint. And but I also would go to this phrase up here, the eyes of the Lord. That sometimes refers to what God sees and sometimes to what God expects to be seen. And Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 21 says, "For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he ponders all their paths," or his paths. So God sees what man is doing. He knows where there's purity in his heart from verse 11, or whether he is doing what he says. Anybody else have any comment on these? I'm going to move through some of these a little quicker today. Verse 13, the lazy man says, "There's a lion outside. I shall be slain in the streets." Now, what does Solomon think about laziness? He's against it. He's trying to portray laziness will bring you to poverty. And laziness is something that Solomon frequently talks about from time to time. But now, I want you to go with me to chapter 26 for just a moment, because this is relevant here to what we're doing. Let's go to verses 13 through 16. It's valuable to see a passage of several verses here. The lazy man says, "There's a lion in the road, a fierce lion in the streets. As a door turns on its hinges, so does a lazy man on his bed. The lazy man buries his hand in a bowl. It wearies him to bring it back to his mouth. The lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly." What's Solomon telling you about the lazy man? He's really lazy. Well, you got to be on the dumb side a little bit, but I want you to notice the very first part that he brings out of this in verse 13 is the fact there's a lion outside, and here he says it's a fierce lion in the streets. Not only is there, how often do you meet a lion walking down the street? Well, I mean, has anybody ever in this class ever met a lion that was not on the other side of a fence? Well, Joe did. In Guyana? Somebody says, "Joe, get out and clean the windshield for us." But the truth is, the likelihood of meeting this kind of animal in a populated area in the street is very unlikely. I mean, it's almost unheard of. And so he says there's a lion, there's a fierce lion in the streets, and here's what he says: "I'll be slain if I go out of there. So I'm not going to do it." I think when you go back to chapter 26 and look at verse 16, he says, "The lazy man is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly." He really can think of more excuses to not work than 7 people can think of to work. I'm often amazed about people who will, and I'm sure teachers face this all the time. They ask their student, "Did you do this?" "No, this come up, this come up, this come up, this come up." What happens is the dog ate it. I left it at home. I thought somebody's adding another one. But all kinds of excuses. If people spent as much time doing what needed to be done as they did in thinking of the excuses, the job will be done. But notice with me verses 14 and 15 of that passage. As a door turns on his hinges, so does a lazy man on his bed. What's he talking about there? Doesn't ever get out of bed. He sleeps all the time. He talks about a little slumber, little folding of the hands of the rest. So shall poverty come on you as a, robber. He's talking about people who never get out and work. And then verse 15, the lazy man buries his hand to the bowl, and it wearies him to bring it back to his mouth. One thing about you can look at me and say, I'm not lazy. The idea of a man here being so lazy that he had put his hand to the bowl, I just don't think I can feed myself. Solomon had a little humor in all this. But what he's trying to say is here, there are people who have that kind of mentality. Well, now I want to take you to a practical application of it in Scripture. Let's go to the book of Numbers, and let's go to chapter 13 and verse 33. Because I think that's a really good application of the principle here. And Moses writes, and the children of Israel, there were giants in the land, and the descendants of the Anak came from the giants, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. They said, we can't take the land of promise because we're like grasshoppers. What are they saying? We're too small. We're powerless. Takes too much effort. First of all, they didn't have faith in God that God was going to be able to lead them into the promised land, just like he had led them all the way to Kadesh Barnea. But the second thing is, there's big people there, and we don't know if we can beat big people or not. There's a lion in the street. I'll be slain if I go out there. Can we get to the point sometimes where we use fear as a defense mechanism for not doing the Lord's work? Let me ask you a question. If you've ever been knocked doors, I don't know how many of you, the first door I knock on, every time I go out and door knock, I'm like, what's that person going to be like who comes to the door? Is he going to be ill? Is he going to be frustrated? And do you know what? I don't know if the Lord does it for me every time or not, but the first person who comes to the door, on the door I knock, is like, well, good morning. How are you doing today? I'm like, whoa, they're being nice. And, that kind of response then makes it easy to go to the next door and knock on the door. And then you go to the next door and knock on it. And after you've knocked about 10 doors, guess what happens? The fear's gone. You realize, hey, people are nice folks for the most part. Now you say, well, did you ever get a bad, angry person come to the door? Well, sure I have. But let me tell you, the most angry person that I met here in McMinnville was over on Oriole Drive. And I hope that by telling this, I don't tell on, well, you wouldn't be able to guess who it was, because this has been many years ago. I went and knocked on the door, and a lady came to the door and said, who are you? What do you want? And I said, well, I'm here with Bobby Branch Church of Christ, and we're advertising our gospel meeting. Oh, I'm a member of the church. First thing was, and then, I can't tell you how gruff it was to start with. But then when I said I was from the church, well, I'm a member of the church. And I'm thinking, well, I hope we're a little more pleasant when someone comes to our door. Stanley?
Why do we fear or have this fear in us when we're knocking on?
I don't know. Well, I think generally we fear what we don't know. And maybe the more we do it, the better we get. But I will say that generally and the same thing is true of the Autumn Street Fair. When we're handing out literature down there, You know, how are people going to respond when I say, you want a daily Bible reading calendar? You'll get somebody who'll come along and say, no, I'm not interested. But you know what most of the people do? Well, yeah, thank you. You know, I appreciate you handing that to me. I've been looking for something to do this. And you'll find out that's a really good way. And you get to meet people from Warren County. And what I find interesting, we got a lot of people who are religious, who come, who are members of denominations and say, hey, y'all got y'all daily Bible reading calendars? And you know what's at the top of every one of those calendars? A chart that teaches the plan of salvation, a chart that teaches. And I'm thinking, we've got that. There's no way these people would let us into their houses and hand them this and say, but we get in our minds sometimes, we can't do things just like the children of Israel did. We can't take the promised land because we're just a bunch of grasshoppers. Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, let me offer, there are some cards on the table as you go out that say a gospel meeting April 3rd through the 6th. Take you a handful of those. And if you say, well, I don't know if I feel comfortable, when you go to the doctor, leave one on the table. When you go to the place, you can leave those cards, put them on a bulletin board somewhere, but even better, hand them to someone and just say, we just want you to know that you're invited, and I guarantee you the gospel will be preached. Brother Jack will do his job in preaching that.
It's not scripture, but there is a saying that so you're never not going to do it.
You're never going to be able to reach that person.
Overcome his fear. So I was going to say too, that Solomon was Rehoboam. It would be very easy for Rehoboam to become a lazy person. He's the king.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone waits on him. Everyone does what he wants. Same for Solomon. So I think it's kind of a lesson in that way too. Not, not who these people are, but don't become this person.
That's true. Okay, let's go to verse 14. The mouth of an immoral woman is a deep pit. He who is abhorred by the Lord will fall there. Now, notice with me, first of all, this word. Has Solomon been talking about the choice of words, going all the way back to verse 10 and the scoffer and the purity of heart, telling the truth? I think sort of the loosely gathered together in this section are the kinds of words that are used by different categories of people. Some people are pure of heart. Some people are scoffers. And in this case is the mouth of the immoral woman, what she says. Now, who is this immoral woman? Well, he uses this phrase, and it's just the same in the original, the strange woman, and what she does. Now, for just a moment, let's go back to the book of chapter 2 of Proverbs, and let's go to verses 16 through 22. Chapter 2, verses 16 through 22. And the reason why I'm tying these together is because sometimes Solomon will use a short statement, one verse. Sometimes he'll have an extended discussion. And he's talking about why he has written this book. And he says, to deliver you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words. Now you see why I pointed out the word mouth. Who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house leads down to death and her paths to the dead. None who go to her return, nor do they regain the paths of life. So that you may walk in the way of goodness and in the paths of righteousness. For the upright shall dwell in the land, and the blameless man will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the earth, and the unfaithful will be uprooted from it. He's talking about the immoral woman and says, I want you to understand, if you follow what she tells you, you're going to end up losing your life. You can go to chapter 5 and look at verses 3 through 5. And he says, for the lips of an immoral woman drip with honey, or drip honey, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but in the end she is as bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lay hold of hell. Now, he's talking about she flatters back in chapter 2. Now her words drip honey. What's he saying about the immoral woman, about the way she communicates? Stay away from her. But she uses flattery. She tells you things that are sweet. And he's trying to warn against that because she's not telling you the truth. She's lying to you so that you will basically pay up her wares. There's another passage I think is valuable, and that is the book of Ecclesiastes in chapter 7 and verse 26, where he says, and I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God shall escape from her, but the sinner will be trapped by her. Saying, if you're not careful, this woman will capture you, she'll catch you, and she'll take advantage of you. So he says the mouth of the immoral woman is a deep pit. What do you mean by a deep pit? All right, I mean, if someone digs a pit that's 3 foot deep, most of us can do what? Climb right out of it. There's one that's probably 6 foot deep. You might be able to get out of it. What if it's 100 feet deep? Probably not going to get out of that one. Now, that's what he's talking about here. The mouth is of a deep pit, and the ones who are abhorred by the Lord will fall there. They'll fall inside of that deep pit. They won't get out is the implication of it. Now, verse 15. I know that everybody loves these child-rearing passages. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him. Now, let's look at the two parts to this verse here. First phrase. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. First of all, what do you mean, foolishness? Pranks and jokes. Okay. Mischievousness. Irresponsibility. I think that's a real good... the fool in the book of Proverbs does not consider the outcome of his behavior. When you're a child, do you have any inclination about what you're doing, how it's going to turn out? No, you don't. You don't think about, hey, if I do this, I'm going to get in really bad trouble about it. You just do it and then experience the consequences later. Now, if you have a child, does a child really think about consequences? No, because they never had any experience with them. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. He doesn't really think about things. Now, I've been very fortunate, as I'm sure many of you have, that I experienced the latter part of this that taught me something. And that is, the rod of correction will do what? Drive it far from him. How many of you in here have ever learned a really good lesson as a child about consequences? I'd say most of us thought that we were much more intelligent than we were when we were 16 to 18 years old. I mean, we really believed at that point in time we knew everything. Now, I'm fixing to turn 65, and I realize how much I don't know. No, I didn't expect it would. I don't think it's going to get any better for a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't think I'm going to learn, a whole lot between now and then. But, as you get older, you start forgetting things. So, I don't think it's going to get a whole lot better than that. But the rod of correction, he's talking about corporeal punishment here. And the Bible's pretty clear about that. In chapter 13 and verse 24, he says, "He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who disciplines him but he who loves him who disciplines him promptly." Or chapter 23 and verses 13 and 14, he says, "Do not withhold correction from a child. If you beat him a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell." In chapter 29 and verse 15, he said, "The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother." Now, the idea in all this is that there has to be some attitude adjustment, some education. And do we get education from pain? Absolutely we do. Yeah, I mean, but even as adults, we learn things from pain, do we not? Yes, and so in this passage, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of correction will drive it far from him. I think when you put this together with what he says in verse 29:15, he says, "A child left to himself brings shame to his mother." How many of us have seen children that's had no discipline? And how do they act? Very badly, very bad. And oh yeah, he had other children, but you got Adonijah and some of the others that were there. I don't know how many children Solomon had. He had a whole lot of wives, but how many he had, I don't know. I would believe that. Because I seem to remember a guy about the 5th grade who a fellow told him to put his finger in a light socket that he wouldn't shock you if it didn't have a light bulb in it. But he acquires that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, what's that? They don't forget it. It's funny as certain levels of pain sticks with you, and you remember that. Okay, let's go to verse 16 now. I don't know if you count a stick a rod or not. Oh, I know what you're saying. Well, generally a rod for them would be a stick, like maybe a bamboo stick, sort of like what you hear in the Southeastern Asian countries where they cane people. And but that's generally what they're thinking about when they think of a rod, not necessarily a steel or a metal pole there. But it would be more than like a belt or something like that. Okay, let's go to verse 16. He who oppresses the poor to increase his riches, and he who gives to the rich will surely come to poverty. Now, one of the interesting things is that the word "and" here is supplied by the translators. And it could be that it belongs there, or it could be that this is one statement by itself. And I take it as if it is two, but I just feel like I'm obligated to tell you that the word "and" is not there. But the person who oppresses the poor to increase his riches. Who's a man who would oppress the poor to increase his riches? The government? Okay, the law. Tax collectors? Y'all got on the government good today, aren't you? Okay. Okay. I don't know how many of you have had any experience with these finance companies, check cashing, title loans and stuff, but do you know what percentage of interest some of them charge? I mean, the minimum is like 25%. And we've had people call us many times who'd say, I've got to go to pay the payday loan. I borrowed $100 from them and now I owe them $250. And I've already paid them about $150. And you're like, how in the world can you borrow $100 and now you owe $250? Well, this penalty, that penalty. But who are they preying upon? The poor people who are struggling to be able to make, and of course you can say, well, they should know better. Well, they should. But that doesn't mean that sometimes people get desperate and search for desperate answers. And it's easy. They make it easy to do that. Who are the telemarketers, the robocalls preying upon? Older people? People who can't afford it are the ones that they feel like they can cheat and they get things away from them. Well, Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 31 says, do not envy the oppressor and choose none of his ways. You look at some rich people and you say, well, how did they get to be rich? Well, maybe I ought to do some of that myself. No. He said, don't do that at all. In chapter 14 and verse 31, he who oppresses the poor reproaches his maker, but he who honors him has mercy on the needy. How do you treat the poor people? Do you look at them as a means to take advantage of them, or do you look at them as an opportunity to help and to show mercy? So oppressing the poor to increase riches, it says, will surely come to poverty. But now let's take the second part here. He who gives to the rich. That's an interesting question. Why would you give to the rich? Curry their favor? Why is that, Willie? You get something in return. In other words, you do something for that rich man so that you feel like he will give you something back in return, maybe even more than you gave him. You do that, you're a dummy. He didn't get to be rich because he gave people more than they gave him. Y'all thought about that? Or, But it's not just, in this instance here, somebody coming to ask for a benevolence, give me this. But the oppressor that oppresses the poor may actually do that in terms of a business deal. And he who gives to the rich may feel like, well, if I show this rich man favor here, what's he going to do for me? Maybe he'll give me something else more in return. That's not the way it works. And he says, both will surely come to poverty here. So you're seeking that. You're not going to find it there and trying to oppress the poor, nor impress the rich. Okay. Well, I will tell you, the Hebrew is very short here. You'll notice the number of italicized words, and so the translators have to decide whether or not it is one of those parallelism, which is synthetic, both of them saying the same thing, or antithetic, saying two different things, and most of them take it as saying two different things, but just to offer that as an option there. Mm-hmm. That's why I'm saying that we see the translation sometimes, and if you just take the words that are not italics and you read those, then you can see how difficult it is to translate this. Okay, let's go to verse 17. Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge. The pursuit of wisdom. What do you have to do in order to find wisdom? Search, listen, read. You got to desire it. Part of the problem is that people who do not acquire knowledge, wisdom, and understanding is because they're not looking for it. They're not seeking it. They're not trying to find it. They're not asking questions. If you, for instance, let's say you're a young person and you've never purchased your first home, what would you want to do if you were going to get ready to buy a home? Okay. You want to go to the realtor who's selling you the house and ask them the questions? Okay. You go to somebody who's bought a house and ask them, what did you do? Well, there's two different ways you can do it. You can do it this way or that way. What was the best way that you did it? Do I need this or do I need that? You ask questions. You seek, the Bible talks about counselors. And the multitude of counselors, there is safety. What he's saying here is incline your ear and hear the words of the wise. Go to someone who has been successful, someone who knows what they're doing. Now, Ricky made a comment a while ago about Dr. Spot, not Mr. Spot, but Dr. Spot, said, don't spank your children. And the point was, how many children did Dr. Spock have? None. So if he has no children, why should I listen to him about how to rear children? Who should you go to when you need help? And you go to the wise and apply your heart to my knowledge. You got to put some effort, some diligence, some thinking into it in all of this. Let me just offer you a couple of passages before we run out of time here. In Proverbs chapter 2, in verses 2 through 5, he says, so that you incline your ear to wisdom, apply your heart to understanding. Yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her as silver and search for her as hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. He said, if you'll go out and you'll try to find knowledge and wisdom and understanding like you would try to find a treasure, that will be helpful to you. And then one other, chapter 5 and verses 1 and 2, he says, my son, pay attention to my wisdom, lend your ear to my understanding, that you may preserve discretion and your lips may keep knowledge, which is where we're going to stop. And next week we'll pick up with verse 18. Okay, to correct it, Dr. Spock had 2 boys. Okay.